So I'm going to present today mostly work done by Atkins, and just before we start, I think I ought to acknowledge a few colleagues, and I've only listed some of them there. So I've been working with a big group of climate data scientists and hydrologists at Atkins. The work's been funded mostly by water companies, but sometimes by government organisations, including the National Infrastructure Commission. And I don't think I'm going to say anything particularly controversial today, but if I do, those will be sort of my opinions and not those of Atkins or any of my clients. I have to warn you, I do have a 16-week-old puppy in the background, as well as sitting on the edge of a school field at lunchtime. So you may hear some noises, but that's not in anticipation for lunch. That's just because I've got a bit going on in the office around me. So first of all, I think we're all clear that we're facing a real challenge with water resources in the UK. And going back to the work that was done, I think pioneering work done on the UK long-term water resources planning framework job in 2017, the challenge is really increasing drought risk due to climate change, population growth, socioeconomic change, and environmental drivers. Currently, the shift or the move towards adopting minimum levels of drought resilience to manage current risks, and that's even before climate change. And the job we all have to do to plan for timely investment in both demand and supply measures while keeping customer bills low. And it's really important for the southeast of England because future climate change, large sustainability reductions, etc., are probably greatest in the southeast and central England compared to other parts of the country. And we all need to know our sort of climate stripes. So on the bottom there, there's just a snapshot of temperatures with reference to pre-industrial temperatures in the Thames Basin. And you can see the picture there, and it's quite interesting looking at some of the years with droughts that I'll talk about later, how that in fact, compared to pre-industrial, the temperatures have been 1 to 2 degrees warmer in those particular years. Compared to, in this case, the 1884 to 1900 period. So just a little bit of a counterfactual, just to think about, well, what if we didn't do anything about this challenge? What would actually happen? I did some really interesting work with the National Infrastructure Commission in 2018 with Doug Hunt, who's now at Affinity, and Vivid Economics. And we looked at the emergency drought responses across England and Wales and the costs of those responses. And what we actually found then was about 1/3 of companies could maintain supplies during severe droughts by implementing their plans, but actually others would find it quite difficult. And that included London, that could have had significant deficits and supply problems. Now, the overall size of the problem, we had a look across all WRMPs and drought plans, and the overall size of the problem without climate change is of the order of 300 to 1100 megalitres a day of water supply shortfalls. And you know, that's a large amount of water, given that I think the supply, I mean, a large water company might supply about 2000 megalitres a day. Now, if you look at drought plans, you might think that, well, it's not a problem because there's 1500 megalitres of measures in drought plans that water companies had previously sort of declared. But actually, we found that when we looked at those in detail, around only 400 megalitres a day of those were really straightforward to implement. The others were all complex, and you know, there is certain uncertainty around how successful they would be in a rapidly developing extreme drought situation. And now the problem is quite an interesting one. If you look at the figure in the top right there, you know, for water companies in the Environment Agency, droughts have a number of phases, from starts, then going through different triggers, levels 1 to 4 shown on that figure, and then a recovery phase. And what we've been seeing, I think, is that the recession in systems and rivers can be so fast that you can actually bang through levels 2 and 3 very quickly, and you just simply don't have time sometimes to put all the measures in place in order to do a really comprehensive drought response. And what we find is that if we need to, you know, we don't know the seasonal forecasts perfectly. So what we find is quite a lot of false alarms that we would start getting ready for drought permits, etc., and then we wouldn't need them. The drought would be broken by heavy rainfall. So certainly that issue gives the impression that triggers were being, you know, restrictions were, you know, potentially being put in place much more often than we would like. So what's our response? I'm just mind the dog. I'm going to put the dog out. The National Infrastructure Commission back in 2018 recommended that the government made sure that there were an additional 4,000 megalitres a day of options in long-term plans. Now, that was quite a quick tick, because at the stage of the draft water resource management plans in 18 and early 19, there were actually already 2,000 megalitres a day of demand side measures and 2,000 megalitres a day of supply side measures in those draft plans. The Water UK study that we did highlighted the significant demand side investments. And I think, you know, companies would argue that they've made very ambitious targets in terms of household water use and leakage reduction. And in those plans, there were quite a lot of large schemes, over 25 megalitres a day, and the costs were around 14 billion. In a similar timescales, the National Framework for Water Resources has been published by the EA, which obviously includes you know, a wide range of water needs, including, you know, the environment and navigation, energy, agriculture, as well as public water supplies. And we've now got you know, a regulatory group led by Ofwat looking at the regulation of large strategic schemes. So the things we're looking at on the supply side are shown in this earlier draft document on the right here, in terms of transfers of water from the north, possibly from the west, into the more pressured southeast of England. So a few slides about rainfall drought, and I should say that I've worked mostly at the sort of climate and hydrological end of the current round of plans, so I'm going to focus mostly on rainfall. And I'd like to take a historical perspective on drought. Please don't be misled. I wasn't at school in the 1930s, but I do love Bilham's work on climate and some of his early books. And I really like this very simple rule of thumb that was used in the 1930s, that engineers used to consider 80% of rainfall over 3 years. So they already had the concept of multi-season droughts, sort of third dry winters, etc., in the 1930s, and they very much focused on design using the worst drought at the time, which was 1900 to 1902. Now, since then, we've obviously had some very serious droughts in the more recent past, particularly 75, 76 in the southeast. And what was quite interesting about that event was, for me, and the learning from it, was that there was a Royal Society commission afterwards on drought, and that covered many things, including water quality and other aspects of drought. But it had a very nice chapter on, you know, what else could happen, and actually explored the use of stochastic modelling in that. So that was Terry Marsh, the Institute of Hydrology, other colleagues there. But at that point, stochastics really didn't catch on. So it wasn't really picked up after the 70s drought. Now, after the droughts in the 90s, we had a strong focus on the reassessment of water company yields, and it was really brought home that we had to consider long climate records from the 1920s at least until the present, in order to make sure that systems could cope with drought. And then, of course, more recently, we've had the sort of multi-season droughts, some sort of near misses where there was concern about the region running out of water. And that's really prompted us to look at different types of drought in terms of magnitude, severity, duration, timing, and so on, rather than just rely on certain historical events. And I think most recently, I think we had some challenges in 2018 with some very high summer peak demands. And that's really brought home to consider both supply and demand impact, including the impacts of heat waves and higher temperatures on summer demand. So just to go through, I mean, the plots on the right are from an out of copyright Royal Metsoc Atlas, but you can see that 1901, the region sort of was had 20% lower rainfall than normal at the time, and then 1902 got down to about 30% of the long-term average in Oxford, and then that was broken by very heavy rainfall in 1903. So that potentially was the first kind of observed flout as a major flood following a long drought period. So if we look at what really drives these dry periods in the UK, we're interested in the connections between atmospheric and sea surface temperature indices and dry periods in the UK. So this is when we, others at Atkins started looking at the North Atlantic Oscillation and sea surface temperatures and how they influenced UK rainfall back in about 2017, 2018, and some of that work was included in the WRMP 19 plans. Now this picture is quite complicated because the North Atlantic Oscillation Index, the impact it has on our rainfall actually flips between winter and summer. So if we have a winter NAO, which is significantly below zero, we expect to have drier conditions in Northern Europe. But if we have a summer NAO well above zero, actually then we also expect drier summers in the UK and parts of Northern Europe. And this is something that Atkins have been looking at now for some time, picking up some of the work that was done at Newcastle by Sarah Naldi and Chris Kilsby on developing rainfall generators. Now this plot on the right shows you a number of factors that affect UK rainfall. So the North Atlantic Oscillation Index, sea surface temperature, East Atlantic, Western Russia, and the Scandinavian indices. Now all of these are a little bit related, but they all have different influences on the UK. And I think the thing to draw out here is that the North Atlantic Oscillation Index has a huge impact on winter rainfall in the northwest of England, and that's well known. But the picture isn't as clear for the southeast. So if we want to look into the southeast, we actually find that other indices are potentially better predictors of dry periods of low rainfall. So you can see, for example, that the East Atlantic Western Russia indicator there for summer is negatively correlated with summer rainfall, and you can see that the Scandinavian index has some explanatory power for autumn rainfall in the southeast. So what the Atkins team have done over the last few rounds of plans is develop and build on the weather generator of Sarah Naldi and Kilsby. So we're getting into stochastic rainfall generation and actually capturing all of those relationships into a statistical model that predicts the average and the variation and random elements of rainfall month to month, and can generate large numbers of monthly, and then we turn those into daily time series. And this plot just shows you some example outputs from that. So on the left, you've got some simulated rainfall on the y-axis and observed rainfall on the x-axis that's ranked from the worst drought, from the lowest rainfall period to the wettest. And our generated data are the blue dots, and the observed data is the red line and dots. And actually, it's a challenging task to do this because we're trying to reproduce droughts over lots of different durations. So the drought vulnerability surface there for the northwest of the Thames Basin shows deficits with respect to a long-term average rainfall over a 3-month, 6-month, 12-month through to 36-month period ending in September. And you can see that the observed data there is the red line for the most recent period, and then the orange line for a more historic period, and the black and grey lines show the data that we generate using this particular tool. And what we've done for this round of plans for this work is we've developed a model for each regional water resources planning group. So there are 5 of those indicated in the legend on the map on the right. So for water resources east, southeast, west, the West Country Water Resources Group and water resources north, we've developed a model, and each of the sites on that plan we've generated 400 sets of daily data between 1950 and 1997. Another way of looking at this is using these heat maps. So this shows you that there are 400 replicates of that climate on the left, and then a time series on the bottom there. And what you generally see here is that you can see that the climate drivers are suggesting a much higher chance of low rainfall in particular years. For example, here 76. But this gives you an enormous data set. So that's 19,200 years of daily rainfall data. And we go through a process of sampling to produce both daily rainfall and daily PT. And that provides sort of spatially coherent data within each of those 5 regions. So I'd be interested if this is, I hope this is working. You should be seeing some animation of drought in the southeast of England. So these plots show 6 and 12-month duration examples of really a drought library for events that are around 1 in 100 years on the left and 6-month duration, and events that are around 1 in 200-year events and 12-month duration on the right. And this is, it's a really useful tool for planners, because rather than just plan, for example, use 1921 as a single drought to plan for, you get a comprehensive library of different events, and you see that actually they've got different characteristics. Some are dry across the region, some are very much dry in particular hotspots, typically focused in East Anglia, Kent, and London. So this is a very powerful tool for water resources planning. Then really the big question that comes up is, if the southeast is in drought, would resources be available from elsewhere? So to answer this question, you've got a range of different evidence sources you can use. Obviously historical data. The stochastics provide really perfect spatial coherence within a region, and also the potential of joining regions together. Regional climate models also provide useful evidence. All of these have pros and cons, and what we'd really like to move to, perhaps later in this round or in future, is producing a national stochastic data set. And to illustrate some of those issues, if you look on the right, the top 2 plots have sort of asked the question, well, what's the correlation between drought in East Anglia and the rest of the country? And on the left, you see some correlation coefficients based on observed data. And on the right, you see some correlation coefficients based on our joined up stochastic data sets. And the basic picture really is, and it's quite easy to understand conceptually, is that the stochastic model does accurately reproduce the positive correlation between low rainfall across the country. And the correlation is slightly weaker, and that's because the model is really getting it right. It's using the same climate drivers for each region. So the part of the low rainfall which is explained by climate drivers is correctly reproduced. But what it's not quite doing is correlating the random element of the rainfall generator, because we generate the regions individually. So that's something that certainly we're working on with colleagues, and is a really key area going forward. So taking a longer term view in climate change, I think everyone will be familiar with the UK climate projections from 2018 and the main headlines from those. But at the moment, it's useful to remind everyone that we are seeing record levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, recorded in 2020. Globally, temperatures are 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial. and I think they're slightly higher than that above pre-industrial in parts of the southeast of England. And we're seeing record high mean sea levels. And we've got a whole range of climate modelling tools to help us look at that and the impacts on drought. Just some examples here in terms of impacts on the southeast. Obviously, climate change impacts are moderated by the catchment response, groundwater response, and water resource systems response. But in very general terms, we'll be seeing much higher temperatures and higher potential evapotranspiration, lower summer river flows, and higher peak demands in summer. And a couple of bits of evidence here on the left, the work done by Jim Hall and others at Oxford on the Marius project, and the weather at home or Marius data set for the Thames is shown there. And that data is being used at a national scale as part of the RAPID programme. And on the right is the product that we've produced, which is a bias corrected version of the UK Met Office regional climate models. And we produced these data for 200 catchments across the UK. And that data is being used by all of the regional groups. In terms of these two evidence sources, they actually show quite a similar picture. The methods involved are different, and each data set has particular strengths and weaknesses. But again, a very useful tool for long-term planning. Now, one issue here is you know, the broader context and how those models sit within a wider framework of different representative concentration pathways, and also the models that were used in the last round of plans. So to provide a bit of context, the plot on the left shows changes in April to September precipitation on the y-axis and degrees warming on the x-axis, and the blue data there in terms of the large cluster of blue dots is the medium emission scenario that was used in the last round of plans. And then the blue, the other blue cloud there is the CMIP5 models for the RCP 8.5 scenario. And then the area I've highlighted in yellow is the output of the Met Office Hadley Centre modelling. So that model sits within the overall range of all the probabilistic data, but you know, it is a little bit warmer and a little bit drier than some of the other climate models that have been used in the past, and that does mean it, you know, it has that particular model and RCP will have a large impact on flows. So the plot on the right is just from a case study in the southwest of England, where we're showing that the impact on average flows is a reduction of around 50%, and the impact on the 95th percentile is similar, and it's a slightly greater impact than in previous plans. So we've done a lot of work to put that in the context of all of the different climate modelling products available. So, you know, from the UK CP website and also the CEDAR archive, everyone has open access to the Met Office's global climate models, which are available for RCP 2.6 and RCP 8.5. You also have access to all of the probabilistic data for the UK. And these plots just show the differences in those data at a seasonal scale for the southeast of England. And again, you can see that our product that we've developed, the RCP 8.5 bias corrected data, at a regional catchment scale, it sits within the range of the probabilistic data produced by UKCP, but it's a little bit warmer, a little bit drier. And again, if we look at some of these other plots, these are again very useful to show the broad range of possible futures under different scenarios, here broken down for each of the UKCP river basins in England and Wales. That's temperatures, and this is the changes in precipitation. And the broad picture here is that if the rates of warming are higher, you tend to see higher increases in winter rainfall and higher decreases, larger decreases in summer rainfall. And of course, the interesting aspect for water resources is to what extent the gains in winter may balance some of the problems in summer, and for that we need to do detailed hydrological and water resources systems modelling. The industry is now involved in both regional planning and water resource management plans for each company, and people are following guidance that's set out by the agency, as well as agreements that have been made for each regional plan. So at the moment, companies are pulling together the results from modelling both the stochastic daily data for looking at the current position and what it means to move from perhaps using a 1 in 50, 1 in 100 year kind of drought for design towards more of a 500-year drought for design purposes, and then looking forward and using climate models to assess the future risks on supply and demand. And that's where, it's important to consider again the range of scenarios. So here's just, we've done some work on scaling of climate model outputs, and my opinion is that RCP 8.5 is the only regional climate modeling product available from UK CP 18. So that's what we've used for modeling, and it's really great for risk assessment. It kind of exposes what the issues are in your system. But it's only, that scenario is only one possible final kind of destination, and it equates to around 4 degrees warming by the 2070s. So of course other scenarios indicate lower rates of warming, and that implies lower rates possibly of declines in summer rainfall and summer flows, and different changes to winter rainfall and winter flows. So we've been looking at this and how to sort of translate results to different scenarios, and how you might sort of use the RCM results. And there's kind of two main things you can do in practical terms. We've provided daily time series from 1981 to 2080 for all the 200 catchments and the regional climate models, and you can actually create factors for any time period. So you could look at the 2050s, which might be closer to a 2-degree world, or the 2070s closer to a 4-degree world above a recent baseline. And really it's just about the pace of that change. So you could use the factors for the 2050s as akin to a sort of proxy 2-degree world, and actually scale that in time to any period you wish. The other thing you can do, and that we've demonstrated, is you can use temperature as a proxy, and you can scale impacts not only through time, which is actually in the Environment Agency guidance to do that, but also across different scenarios. And we've really demonstrated that certainly in the southeast that we're talking about today, the change in temperature indicated by the different UK CP products is actually quite a good predictor in terms of the change of rainfall drought in future. So we've looked at that particularly for the southeast and Anglian, and found that that scales pretty well. So where you don't have other modelling evidence from different emission scenarios, there is potential to scale using temperature as a proxy. So just going to thinking about the job of how important are stochastics and how important are climate change scenarios. These are some plots that have perturbed some historic rainfall drought metrics for different climate change products, but also looked at the stochastic results on the bottom there. And if we compare the two products, actually the the impact of stochastics and changing the level of resilience is actually not dissimilar from some of the climate change impacts. And what we actually find is for climate change, if we're looking at rainfall drought metrics that's kind of balanced winter and summer rainfall, they indicate that drought risk is likely to either stay the same or increase in future, because under a number of scenarios, wetter winters can terminate the decline in summer rainfall. But if we're focused very much on summer metrics or metrics that include 2 summers and 1 winter, for example, we're generally seeing a large increase in risk in future. I've rushed through some of that conscious of time, but we'll end with just some reflections on this, and particularly I think in the last few years, I think I started this work when back in the 90s, when Nigel Arnell and Nick Reynard had done work with UK CPO2, and we were working with 3 climate scenarios and historic climate, and now we've moved to a situation where we have an enormous range of climate modelling products, and we're using stochastic data sets, and plus we're modelling hundreds and hundreds of catchments across the country. So arguably we're moving into a sort of arms race of modelling, and it's useful to step back and think about what we really need. I think bearing in mind as well that, I mean, the planning cycle, we benefit from a 5-year cycle of planning. Climate change is, of course, just one part of a much bigger jigsaw of uncertainties in the planning process, and we could spend 5 years doing climate change modeling, but we just don't have that much time. So just some views, and I think what we need to think about. Firstly, starting from where Emma began the presentation, that it's Earth Day. There's a lot of demand measures in plans, but none of this is going to change or work on the demand side unless there's behavioural change and everyone uses water more wisely. It's quite interesting, obviously, during the latest pandemic, we've seen a lot of increases in household demand as behaviour has changed and people spend more time at home. So, it has a huge impact. I think it's a really important first step to understand the current risks of drought and a range of different drought events before we even start thinking about climate change. And I think the stochastic tools we've developed give people the opportunity to do that. I don't personally think we need to get hugely precise and hung up on annual probabilities and return periods. I think it's a really good step forward that we are testing systems to more extreme droughts with very different characteristics, and that we're prepared for those events when they come along. In terms of longer term climate change, I think we need to, whatever methods are used and whatever tools are applied by different regional groups, I think it's really important to clearly demonstrate that you understand the risks related to different scenarios, at least a 2-degree and a 4-degree warming scenario. And then I think plans can be worked out around that, and that should be about looking at a range of options and understanding the trigger points and different pathways for different future scenarios. So we shouldn't just be pinning our hopes on saying, right, we're planning for this scenario and sticking with it. We really need to demonstrate that we understand the range of possible futures, whatever planning methods we use. I think when it comes to the sort of national and regional picture, we do need to look at sort of multiple sources of evidence to test regional transfers, and that's going to be an important part of planning this year. Of course, it's not just about public water supply. We've got to factor in all of the other issues related to agriculture, energy demand, water quality that will also be affected by climate change. And I think we can all get stuck in really detailed modelling exercises. I'm also heavily involved in things like adaptation reporting and the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And I think there's a real need to step back and produce very clear messaging for customers and also to investors on the level of risk that we're facing from climate change on water resources. So I think that's a key thing. We need to get the message across clearly to a wide range of groups. And it's just one of climate change, as I've already said, one of the many uncertainties. And I think we do benefit from the 5-year cycle of planning we have in the UK. So we need to make sure that, you know, if the rate of climate change is following the higher emission scenarios, that we do put things in place in good time, because it takes a long time to develop major water resources schemes. But we have the opportunity to reflect on that every 5 years, which makes the whole process pretty adaptive and flexible and reasonably agile. So that's all I want to say, Emma. So hopefully I didn't rush the second half of that too much, but quite happy to take questions.
Right, great. Thanks very much, Steve. That's a very interesting and informative presentation. I hope you're not running away.
No, I'm not running away. Just closing the door.
Closing the door. Yeah, thank you. That's very, very informative. There are a few questions in the chat pane, so I will. I'll read them out one by one if that's okay, and we'll go through them by then. So the first one we've got here from Laura Dawkins. She says, could you possibly explain a bit more about how you bias correct the UK CP18 data?
Okay, I have actually just put up some references. So we followed the method of Lee, Sheffield and Wood 2010, which is referenced at the bottom of that slide. So it's a form of quantile mapping that basically looks at how well the climate model performs during an observed period. So we compared the regional climate model to the HAD UK observed data. And then our correction is really quite detailed. It looks at a moving window of 30 days, and it corrects the statistical distribution of daily rainfall in the models to match the observed data, and assumes that that relationship carries on in future. So quantile mapping is a fairly well-established approach, and there are different subtle ways of doing it. The way that we chose to use, the one that we chose to use was very detailed, and the reason we did that is because we wanted to get the daily rainfall intensity right, as well as the monthly and seasonal water balance, because that's very important if you've got kind of small reservoirs with very little storage. Your daily rainfall can be quite important. Some of the other modeling products around have used a simpler bias correction process. All have pros and cons, but we went for a particular one that was quite detailed.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here from Trevor Newton. Trevor says, thanks for a great talk. He's also asked, the severity of droughts in southeast England is partly based on sequential dry rivers. Sorry, I'll read that again. Partly based on sequential dry winters affecting groundwater recharge. So it's not solely climate, but a sequence of 2 or 3 dry winters. So he's asking, how are regional climate models, how well do they link with the severity upon groundwater resource stress?
Yeah, well, thanks, Trevor. I mean, if we take the stochastic modeling first, obviously we're looking at all the durations, and we're fitting, we're trying to make sure that model fits multi-season droughts up to 36 months. Regional climate models, as part of the project, we very much focused on how well they fit daily, monthly and seasonal climate. We didn't do any specific tests on how well the regional climate models reproduced subsequent dry winters, etc. And that's something we could do more of. But they have a physically based representation of the climate in them, and I think they don't do a perfect job, but they should be picking up the possibility of longer dry periods. But we probably need to do more of that, and in fact that's something I wanted to do in the context of regional transfers, is have a closer look at the regional climate model performance.
Okay, thanks. Sounds like a good area for further work then. Good question. Okay, so we have another question here from David Price. Does the stochastic modelling assume that the training period data is from a stationary climate?
Yeah, I mean that is an issue. I mean, what we do is we don't train the data, we don't train the stochastic model on data up to the present day. We cut it, that's why we cut it short in the 90s. So the model has been trained on 1950 to 97. Okay, so arguably we saw some upward movement in temperature before then, but the primary variable we look at is of course rainfall. So there is a certain assumption that there is a bit of an assumption of stationarity there, but on the other hand, trends in rainfall are not that obvious over that period. Trends in temperature are. So it does assume, but we try and protect ourselves a bit from this. So we say basically the stochastic model is it's really before the acceleration of climate change impacts, and then the climate change modeling deals with future non-stationary climate impacts. So when we put both together, but it's a tricky area.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think you're never going to get a period when there's no change, are you? So right, we have another question here from, I hope I'm going to pronounce this right, Mubashir Hussain, who says, hi Steve, great work. They understand linear scaling is applied in this study, and they'd like to know whether the team looked into quantile-based scaling for precipitation projection to address the overestimation during wet seasons and underestimation of rainfall during dry seasons. Yeah,
well, we did use a quantile-based method, so it wasn't just linear scaling. So that's kind of included, and I'd refer again to the reference, the Lee, Sheffield and Wood reference that we used. If in our report we did some quite we did a series of plots which showed how good or bad the fit of the RCM was to start at all different timescales, and how our bias correction fixed that data essentially. And we showed that this method that we use did really well at correcting both the means and the variance, the year-to-year variance of rainfall. So we were really happy with it. Some of the other modeling products and published papers do a quantile-based mapping method, which is far more focused on just getting the monthly rainfall averages right. Whereas this, the model that we used, as I said, we wanted to get the daily rainfall intensity right as well. So from that point of view, it had a lot more parameters. You could argue it was over parameterized, but it corrected the data very well.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, the questions are coming in thick and fast now, Steve, so I'll keep reading. We can go through a few more. There's another one here from Matt James at Stantec. He says, your work on NAO found a 7-year cycle in increased severe droughts. He assumes this is still apparent in the stochastic data sets, but asks, is it perhaps more useful in forecasting than the DO calculation?
Well, I mean, I try and answer that. I mean, I'm not. I think work looking at the cycle of NEOs was probably more Doug and Lauren before I got involved. You know, I think in terms of you do see cycles in all of these indicators, and I would probably give Will Rust a plug. I think Will Rust has got a presentation this week on the hidden cycles in the UK hydrological cycle. So he's done a lot of work on that at Atkins, and I think the forecasting area is one that's really really growing. So you've basically got two ways of forecasting some of this stuff on a medium range and seasonal scale. One is to use the ECMWF products, so numerical weather prediction models, and the other is to use statistical models like the one we've got can be used in forecasting mode. And I think that kind of thing would be very helpful for water companies when they face a sort of uncertainty looking at a season ahead. There's some good work going on that within the sector at the moment.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here from Cordula Wittykind. Could you repeat how many general circulation models were considered in the impact analysis, please?
So our product uses the regional climate model, so that's 12 members, or 12 versions of that model for RCP 8.5. And then we also work with the global climate models, of which there's 28. I can't always remember the exact number, but probably 15 Hadley Center models. Maybe there was 13 CMIT 5 models, and then only I think 3 of the Hadley models didn't make the regional climate models. So yeah, I mean we've basically, I mean, we've looked at everything there is available, water companies have different regional groups are doing different things, but they've all used the RCM data, and some have used probabilistic data, some have used GCMs. So I think across the board, all of these products are being used live in different regional plans at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll keep going. There's another interesting question here from Divesh Mistry, saying, how are changes in evaporation rates over time due to a warming climate accounted for? So thinking about PET, and how does that affect sort of selecting different water resource options and water yields? For example, there might be more viability for aquifer storage and recovery if it's effective in a certain place rather than new reservoirs.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps all future reservoirs will be covered with floating solar panels, which I don't know if that will lower evaporation rates. But yeah, I mean, in a lot of the modelling that's done, PET is estimated using temperature-based formula, and I suppose how people do their water source systems modelling may vary. But in the olden days, certain simplifying assumptions were made that PET losses from a reservoir surface were balanced by inflows from the banks of the reservoir or direct catchment, things like that. But I think nowadays PET losses are probably modelled from these new reservoir schemes, and whether it makes things more viable or not probably boils down to costs. I mean, I think aquifer storage and recovery is not my thing, but I think there are uncertainties, costs and risks related to different options, and all of that needs to be weighed up together. I guess I would say it's clear that parts of the southeast with a large base flow and lots of groundwater, in very general terms, are going to be more robust to climate change than areas with very flashy responses and less storage. So storage is always a good thing.
Yes, I agree. Okay, so we've got just 2 more questions here. So, and I'm aware there's only a few minutes, so we'll see if we can get through them. The first is from Elizabeth Brock at the Met Office. Thanks for the talk, very interesting. She says, she sees from your presentation that the correlation of drought across the country spatially is shown well in the stochastic data set, but could you comment on how well the severity is correlated across the UK with this current data set? And she's got a second question. What is the biggest behavioural change that we could make to reduce the demand on water in the future? That's a slight aside there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think the severity, I mean, drought severity within each region is I think well correlated and you know, well reproduced by the stochastic data set. I may need to check with colleagues exactly what tests we've done, but I'll just explain what we've done to sort of match the stochastic data set. So we've modeled 5 regions which overlap, and what we've done is we've compared drought severity as it's reproduced in all of those data sets, and then we've basically sort of matched them in a way that so we've matched them in a way that is realistic. So we've basically filtered out any pairings of drought data sets between regions that aren't well correlated. So we're only using the ones which are most realistic, and that's quite detailed and it's still under, you know, under review. But basically, I'd say we've worked hard to get the best picture, or the most realistic picture as possible, when we're looking at the national picture. But there's still you know, there's still some work to do there. And behavioural change, yeah, I mean, so people who work on demand, it's clear some of our major uses are outdoor use of water, but it's all the obvious things around you know, shower heads and water efficiency and water reuse in the home, which I'm sure CyWEM promotes widely, as well as. But I found that, I mean, recent work on this, I found, you know, the WaterWise is always my go-to place for you know, water saving tips, and then similar information's now, you know, available from most water companies and National Trust and others. So I'll direct people to those sites.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And now there's just one final question here from Doris Wend, I think. Thanks for the great talk. When putting together the high demands in summer and for summer and wetter winters, she's thinking of water storage options for water supply. And she's wondering if you've included any options for sort of water storage in your modelling work, or if you have any recommendations to water managers. Yeah,
well, I think, you know, in very general terms, as long as you're doing, you know, we're all doing the demand side measures, you know, on the supply side, storage is one of the key things we can do. So whether that's new surface water storage or groundwater storage is generally a good thing, and it is being very thoroughly considered by the regional groups and the water companies. So I've not personally been heavily involved in the water resources systems modelling, but you could see from the map I showed at the beginning of the slides that, you know, that a number of strategic options are being considered, and those include a number of large number of reservoirs or supported transfers where there's a reservoir and a transfer.